So there we have it. And now let's take a look at a few summaries of the highlights of this budget, this 2014-2015 budget. First of all, it is good to understand what 1.7 trillion shillings looks like in numbers. That's right. You can count the zeros, 9 zeros. That's the kind of budget the government is looking at this year. And of course, like we've told you, this is the biggest budget in Kenya's history. And last year's expenditure was actually 1.6 trillion. So this has gone up significantly. If you compare it with the year before that, the budget was around 1 trillion in terms of expenditure. So obviously with devolution, that number did skyrocket, and now we see ourselves at a budget of 1.7 trillion shillings. Now, moving forward, let's take a look at what we can expect. Well, in terms of recurrent expenditure, now this is just the money that the government uses to run the government. That's right, salaries, wages, meetings, conferences. That's standing at 20.8% of the GDP. Now, that's rather high because the recommended amount is actually 12%, meaning we're 8% over where we should be in terms of how much we are spending. If we look at development expenditure, on the other hand, it's half of what we're spending on running the government. We're only spending 10.2% of our GDP on actual development programs. And this is made even worse by the fact that our absorption rate, which means how much of the money you actually allocate to development is spent for that purpose, our absorption rate as of last year was at 45.8%, which means if the government allocates 100 shillings to development, only 45 of those shillings will actually be spent for that purpose. But let's zero down now on some of the sectors that, of course, are really crucial to economic growth. Food security and agriculture. What is the government planning to spend? Well, they're looking at 9.5 billion for irrigation projects to make sure that people are not just farming for themselves, for subsistence, but they're also farming things that they can sell commercially. And they're going to be spending on strategic grain reserves, fisheries. They're also reviving the Kenya Meat Commission. And now this is an interesting one. 3.5 billion is going to the Galana irrigation project. Now this is very interesting because in the last financial year, 3.6 billion was allocated for the first phase of that very same project. So, of course, the question is, what happened to the 3.6 billion that was allocated in the last financial year? Was it in fact used to make any progress at all with that particular project? Let's move on to education, though. The government is spending about 139 billion shillings on that. And if we compare it with last financial year, that was 273 billion. So there's a significant reduction. But once again, a very interesting point which we'll come to. They're spending on free education, obviously, as they do every year, promoting teachers as well, training institutes. They're also providing sanitary towels for girls in schools. And they're recruiting 5,000 more teachers at 2.3 billion. But if we look at our next slide here, once again, 17.4 billion has been allocated for the notorious laptop project, digital content, computer laboratories. But what's interesting is in the last financial year, 53.2 billion was allocated for the deployment of 1.35 million laptops last year. So again, you have to ask yourself, why are we seeing the same things in this budget as in the last budget, and it doesn't seem like we've made any progress? Let's go to healthcare. 10.5 billion shillings allocated for free primary healthcare. Of course, that includes the maternal healthcare that the government is making progress in. Leasing equipment also for hospitals, an internship program for doctors and nurses. They're spending 4 billion on that maternal health program. 8.4 billion goes to Kenyatta National Hospital. That's actually the biggest spending in terms of the healthcare docket. That will go to Kenyatta National Hospital and that as well. If we move on to transport, 41 billion shillings is going to ongoing road construction, and in terms of new roads, 10 billion shillings. If you're in Nairobi, you might be happy to hear that some money has actually been allocated to decongest road junctions in Nairobi, 1 billion shillings for that. We're also spending 19.4 billion shillings on the standard gauge railway. Let's next talk about security. Definitely a hot issue right now. 6.7 billion shillings is going to be spent on acquiring police vehicles, actually leasing them because that's much cheaper, and aircraft as well for police. 2.9 billion is going to be spent on recruiting 10,000 police and security officers. And this is very good news for the police service. A police medical insurance scheme, 1.6 billion has been allocated for that. Of course, a lot of arguments are raised about the state of security, also depending on people who are underpaid and not very well taken care of. Well, now there's 1.3 billion for police and security officers' houses, and also, as far as the poaching conversation goes, 1.8 has been allocated to that. And this is what we're spending on Amazon, 6.1 billion shillings, which is almost as much as what we're spending on leasing some police vehicles and aircraft. Now, in terms of where is this money coming from and how much do we have? We have a 356.9 billion shilling deficit last year. This year, it's slightly less at 342.3 billion shillings this year. Now, this is the money that the government has to raise somehow outside the budget, most likely from taxes. And if we look at what they did last year to cover the deficit, well, they actually, one of the things they did was impose a 1.5% railway development levy on everything that was imported. And this actually did really, really well for them. They did target raising 10 billion shillings in a year from that tax, but they raised in just 16 months 13 billion shillings. So they might be looking at something similar, perhaps raising that number from 1.5% to 3%. That might be something that will happen. We don't yet know which taxes are going to bring up that deficit, but we can be certain that it will be coming from somewhere. So, Wilson, that's how it stands as far as the budget goes. We can probably brace ourselves for having to make up that.
You know, the most disconcerting thing about is this absorption issue. That every 45 shillings out of 100 shillings that is allocated in the budget does not go...
Actually, it's more like 60 shillings.
It's 50 shillings, 55 shillings does not go to the intended use. So the question being, where does that money go to?
Exactly. And like you've seen, we have so many things in the budget that are there. Again, they're there year after year after year, but we're not necessarily seeing the kind of progress.
Last year we allocated 53 billion shillings to the laptop project.
Yes.
This year we're allocating 17 billion shillings. We've still not seen that laptop projects, being initiated.